Patrick Floyd Jarvis Garrett was born on June 5, 1850, in Chambers County, Alabama, as the second of 5 children to John Lumpkin Garrett and Elizabeth Ann Jarvis. Of English descent, Garrett's ancestors hailed from Hertfordshire, Northamptonshire, Bedfordshire, Lincolnshire, and Buckinghamshire in England. When Garrett was 3, his father purchased the John Grier plantation in Claiborne Parish, Louisiana. However, the Civil War devastated the family's finances. Garrett's mother passed away at the age of 37 on March 25, 1867, when he was just 16 years old. Less than a year later, on February 5, 1868, his father died at 45, leaving the children with a heavily indebted plantation, owing over $30,000. The siblings were taken in by relatives, and Garrett, at 18, left Louisiana and headed west on January 25, 1869. Garrett's activities during the next 7 years remain unclear. By 1876, he had made his way to Texas, working as a buffalo hunter. During this time, he killed his first man, a fellow hunter named Joe Briscoe. Garrett turned himself in to authorities at Fort Griffin, Texas, but they chose not to pursue charges against him. As buffalo hunting declined, Garrett left Texas and traveled to the New Mexico Territory. Upon arriving at Fort Sumner, New Mexico, he found employment as a bartender and later as a cowboy for Pedro Menard Maxwell. Garrett's first wife was Juanita Martinez, born in May of 1860 in Taos, New Mexico. The couple married in the fall of 1879, with notable figures such as Tom O'Folliard, Charlie Beaudry, and Billy the Kid reportedly attending the wedding. Tragically, during a celebration of their recent marriage, Juanita collapsed while dancing and passed away the following day at just 19 years old. She was buried in Fort Sumner Cemetery. On January 14, 1880, Garrett married Apolinaria Gutierrez. Between 1881 and 1905, the couple had 8 children: Ida, Dudley, Elizabeth, Annie, Patrick, Pauline, Oscar, and Jarvis. Billy the Kid, born Henry McCarthy and later known as William Henry Boney Jr., was a fugitive wanted for murder following the Lincoln County War. On November 2, 1880, Pat Garrett was elected sheriff of Lincoln County, New Mexico, defeating incumbent sheriff George Kimball by a vote of 320 to 179. Though Garrett's term officially began on January 1, 1881, Sheriff Kimball appointed him as deputy sheriff for the remainder of his term. Garrett also secured a deputy U.S. Marshal commission, enabling him to pursue Billy the Kid across state lines. On November 30, 1880, Garrett and his posse raided the Diedrich Ranch at Bosque Grande, aiming to capture Billy the Kid. Although the Kid was not there, they arrested John Joshua Webb, wanted for murder, and George Davis, accused of horse theft. Garrett handed them over to the sheriff of San Miguel County before continuing to the settlement of Puerto de Luna, where he shot a local troublemaker, Mariano Leva, in the shoulder after a confrontation. On December 19, 1880, Billy the Kid, along with Charlie Beaudry, Tom Pickett, Billy Wilson, David Rudabaugh, and Tom O'Folliard arrived in Fort Sumner. Garrett and his posse were lying in wait. Mistaking O'Folliard for the Kid, Garrett's men opened fire, killing O'Folliard while the others escaped unharmed. 3 days later, Garrett's posse trapped Billy and his group at a location called Stinking Springs. In the ensuing encounter, Beaudry was killed and the rest of the group was captured. On April 15, 1881, Billy the Kid was sentenced to hang by Judge Warren Bristol. However, 13 days later, he escaped custody, killing 2 deputies in the process. On July 14, 1881, Garrett traveled to Fort Sumner to question a friend of Billy the Kid about his whereabouts. He learned the Kid was staying with Pedro Menard Maxwell. Around midnight, Garrett entered Maxwell's home. The Kid, unaware of Garrett's presence, woke during the night and entered Maxwell's bedroom. Standing in the shadows, Garrett remained unnoticed. The Kid, speaking in Spanish, repeatedly asked, "Who is it?" Garrett responded by firing 2 shots. The first struck the Kid in the chest, just above the heart, killing him. The second shot missed. Garrett's account does not clarify whether Billy died instantly or shortly thereafter. After Billy the Kid's death, writers quickly began crafting books and articles that elevated him to the status of folk hero, while portraying Pat Garrett as a cold-blooded assassin. Despite containing numerous factual inaccuracies, The Authentic Life of Billy the Kid, written by Garrett with assistance from Ash Upson, became the primary source for most works about the kid until the 1960s. In 1882, Garrett chose not to run for re-election as sheriff of Lincoln County. He relocated to Texas, where he made an unsuccessful bid for a seat in the state Senate. Briefly serving as a captain with the Texas Rangers for less than a month, Garrett eventually returned to Roswell, New Mexico. In 1885, Garrett discovered a significant artesian water reservoir in the Roswell area and partnered with two men to establish the Pecos Valley Irrigation and Investment Company on July 18th. He continued to pursue irrigation projects for several years, and on January 15, 1887, he bought a 1/3 interest in the Texas Irrigation Ditch Company. However, his partners eventually pushed him out. On August 15, 1887, Garrett formed a new partnership with William L. Holloman, creating the Holloman and Garrett Ditch Company. Despite his efforts, all of Garrett's ventures in irrigation ended in failure. By 1892, Garrett moved his large family to Uvalde, Texas, where he became close friends with John Nance Garner, who would later serve as Vice President of the United States. Garrett might have spent the rest of his life in Uvalde, but a high-profile event back in New Mexico changed his course. On January 31, 1896, Colonel Albert Jennings Fountain and his 8-year-old son Henry disappeared near the White Sands area in southern New Mexico. Despite extensive investigations by Apache Scouts, the Pinkertons, and even a full-fledged effort by the Republican Party, neither of the Fountains were ever found, and the case remained unsolved. In April of 1896, Garrett was appointed sheriff of Donna Ana County. 2 years later, he had gathered enough evidence to make arrests and sought warrants for the capture of Oliver M. Lee, William McNew, Bill Carr, and James Gillian. Within hours of receiving the warrants, Garrett arrested McNew and Carr. In the early hours of July 12, 1898, Garrett and his posse confronted Lee and Gillian at a location called Wildly Well near Eau Grande, New Mexico. Garrett had hoped to capture them while they slept, but the fugitives, anticipating trouble, had taken their bedrolls to the roof of the bunkhouse. When one of Garrett's deputies, Kearney, heard footsteps on the roof and climbed a ladder to investigate, he was mortally wounded by the fugitives. A stray bullet grazed Garrett, but his primary concern was for his dying deputy. Garrett called a temporary truce and withdrew, along with Kearney, to be carried to a wagon. However, Kearney died on the way to Las Cruces. Lee and Gillian remained free for another 8 months before finally surrendering to Sheriff George Curry. They were found not guilty in the Fountain killings, and the charges for the deputy's death were also dropped. Garrett's final confrontation took place in 1899 when he killed a fugitive named Norman Newman, who was wanted for murder in Greer County, Oklahoma. Newman had been hiding at the San Augustine Ranch in New Mexico. Sheriff George Blalock of Greer County traveled to New Mexico and requested Garrett's help. Together with Garrett's deputy, Jose Espaldin, the lawmen rode to the ranch, where on October 7, 1899, a gunfight broke out, and Newman was killed. On December 16, 1901, President Theodore Roosevelt nominated Garrett as the Collector of Customs for El Paso. Garrett became one of Roosevelt's 3 White House gunfighters, along with Bat Masterson and Ben Daniels. Despite public outcry over the appointment, Garrett was confirmed by the U.S. Senate on January 2, 1902. Garrett's time as El Paso's Collector of Customs was tumultuous from the beginning. On May 8, 1903, he became involved in a public fistfight with an employee, George Gaither. The next day, both Garrett and Gaither were fined $5 for disturbing the peace. Complaints about Garrett's alleged incompetence continued to reach Washington, but President Roosevelt continued to support him. As a show of solidarity, Roosevelt invited Garrett to attend a Rough Riders reunion in San Antonio in April of 1905. Although Garrett had never been part of the Rough Riders, the invitation was seen as a rebuke to critics who had called for Garrett's removal. At the event, Garrett introduced Tom Powers, a guest of his, as a prominent Texas cattleman. Garrett and Powers were photographed with Roosevelt, first standing in a group and later seated with him at dinner. Garrett's enemies managed to obtain copies of the photos and sent them to Roosevelt, pointing out that Powers was not a cattleman, but the owner of a notorious El Paso saloon, the Coney Island Saloon. This revelation proved to be the final straw for Roosevelt, who replaced Garrett as Collector of Customs on January 2, 1906. After his dismissal, Garrett returned to New Mexico with his family, facing severe financial difficulties. His ranch was deeply mortgaged, and when he was unable to make the payments, the county auctioned off all of Garrett's personal belongings to satisfy the judgments against him. The auction raised just $650. Meanwhile, President Roosevelt had appointed Garrett's friend, George Curry, as the territorial governor of New Mexico. Garrett met with Curry, who assured him he would be appointed superintendent of the territorial prison in Santa Fe once Curry was inaugurated. However, with the inauguration still months away, Garrett, in dire financial straits, left his family behind in New Mexico and returned to El Paso, where he secured a job with the real estate firm of H.M. Maple & Company. During this time, Garrett began living with a woman known as Mrs. Brown, who was described as a prostitute in El Paso. When Governor-elect Curry learned of Garrett's involvement with her, he rescinded the offer for the prison superintendent position. Dudley Poe Garrett, Pat's son, had signed a 5-year lease for his Bear Canyon ranch with Jesse Wayne Brazel. Tensions arose when Brazel began bringing in large herds of goats, which were viewed negatively by cattlemen like Garrett. Garrett attempted to break the lease upon learning that the money for Brazel's operation had come from his neighbor, W.W. Bill Cox. He was further angered when he discovered that Archie Prentice Road was Brazel's partner in the large goat herd. When Brazel refused to cancel the lease, the dispute was taken to court. At this point, James B. Miller intervened in an attempt to resolve the issue. After meeting with Brazel, Miller helped broker a deal where Brazel agreed to cancel the lease, provided a buyer could be found for his herd of 1,200 goats. Carl Adamson, who was related to Miller by marriage, agreed to purchase the goats. However, when the deal seemed set, Brazel claimed he had miscounted his herd and now had 1,800 goats, not 1,200. Adamson refused to buy such a large number, but agreed to meet with Garrett and Brazel to try to negotiate a resolution. Garrett and Adamson traveled together from Las Cruces, New Mexico, in Adamson's wagon. Along the way, Brazel appeared on horseback. During the encounter, Garrett was shot and killed, but who fired the fatal shot remains a matter of controversy. Brazel and Adamson left Garrett's body by the side of the road and returned to Las Cruces, where Brazel surrendered to Deputy Sheriff Felipe Lucero. Over 30 years later, Lucero recalled Brazel's confession, saying, "Lock me up. I've just killed Pat Garrett." Brazel then pointed to Adamson and added, "He saw the whole thing and knows that I shot in self-defense." Brazel was arrested, and a coroner's jury was convened to investigate the murder. Brazel's trial for Pat Garrett's death concluded on May 4, 1909. Represented by attorney Albert Bacon Fall, who would later become Secretary of the Interior, Brazel was acquitted. The trial lasted only a day, and the key eyewitness, Adamson, never testified, leaving the true events surrounding Garrett's death unresolved. Standing at 6 feet 5 inches, Garrett's body was too tall for any of the available coffins, so a custom one had to be sent from El Paso. His funeral service took place on March 5, 1908, and he was buried beside his daughter, Ida, who had passed away in 1896 at the age of 15. Garrett's grave, along with those of his descendants, is located in the Masonic Cemetery in Las Cruces.